It's really exciting to see all of you here, and I thought since I was going to go first that I might provide a little bit of a bigger picture context about the land-grant university and food and feeding people, and then talk a bit about the institutional framework. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a land-grant university is, in 1862 Congress passed what's called the Morrill Act. The idea was, at the time, that the states that existed were to receive a tract of land from the federal government, which they could then sell, and the proceeds from that sale could be used to build a university for the people. At the time, higher education was the province of the highly educated. Schools were private. Almost all of them tended to be affiliated with a religious institution. Most of them obviously were located in the eastern part of the United States. And so the idea that Justin Morrill and his congressional colleagues had was that education, part of democracy is that education should be accessible to all. And at the time, of course, most people were living in a rural context. There were city dwellers, but the bulk of folks were situated in rural environments, most of them involved with subsistence level farming as the primary way of feeding themselves and their families. So the land-grant institution was founded to serve those people. A person like my father, who grew up poor on what we now call an organic farm in central Minnesota with no electricity, no running water, and they were too poor to afford a tractor, so they did all their farming with draft horses and a plow. And he was the first person in his family to go to college and at the University of Minnesota, and then put his sister and brother through here on the St. Paul campus in dietetics and in the ag sciences. And so the idea of the land grant was not only to serve this broader public, but it existed with three design principles. One was to provide vocational training for the American populace so that they could contribute to the economy. The second principle was that it provided a civic education so people would become effective citizens as in the democracy. So they had the training they needed, vocational skills to make a living. They had the civic skills they needed to be informed citizens, to exercise their rights and engagement in a democracy. And the third underpinning was associated with the liberal education. So what did it take to be an educated person? What were the basic sort of skills that you needed to be an educated and informed citizen? And so it was those three design principles that led to the initial sort of formulation of what people would be educated like at a land-grant university. So that was 1862. In 1890, a second Morrill Act was passed to address the former Confederation, the Confederacy in the South. And multiple historically black colleges and universities were established at the time. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, Congress passed legislation that formed the Extension Service with the idea that it wasn't just students that had to come to campus to learn how to be farmers, that there needed to be some kind of integration of research and then technical training of people who were already farming so that they could become better farmers, that they could appropriate technology that would make them more efficient, that would increase their income, et cetera. And so the Cooperative Extension Service was founded not only to educate farmers, but also to educate farm wives in some of what we call the art of homemaking. So it was the food production side as well as the food consumption side and the homemaking side as well. And so Extension served this broad set of functions for a long time. So that's kind of the general scope of why the land-grant universities were founded, and now you find them in every state, and now we have things like the Sea Grant University, and so that original land-grant concept has been extended. Most states have two kinds of public universities: the research university that has their medical school, their dental school, their law school, etc., their professional schools, and then they have their land-grant university that deals with veterinary medicine, what we used to call home economics, the ag and food sciences, and natural resources. In the case of the University of Minnesota, we're both. We're a dual hybrid institution. We're both Minnesota's Level 1 research university that has all those professional education functions. We're also a land-grant university, and we're one of the few land-grant universities in the country that's located in an urban setting. Many of them are located in more rural communities, and we're one of the few in Minnesota that has that dual identity and also is situated in an urban setting, which changes the texture and identity of this institution and the role it plays for the state. So that said, there's typically 3 parts of the land-grant mission. The first one is research, the second one is teaching, and the other one is called outreach, and in more contemporary terms, people call it oftentimes engagement, so that kind of civic interplay and partnership that the institution has with the public to produce something for the public good. So that's a little bit of the background in land-grant universities. Most recently, in 1994, Congress passed another land-grant related act, which was to support the formation and sustaining tribal colleges. So now tribal colleges on reservations across the country also have land-grant status. Most of them are 2-year schools. There's a couple 4-year schools, and a couple more that are developing 4-year programs. And there was a time in the Midwest where in the 3 states, Minnesota, North, and South Dakota, we had about 1/3 of the tribal colleges overall in the country. So we're pretty land-grant rich here in the upper Midwest. We've got a bunch of them. So that's sort of a broad overview. And then when you look at these design principles of the land grant, this idea of vocational education, this idea of civic education, and then the idea of a liberal education, you start to see a few things begin to manifest. And as the land grant university evolved toward the middle of the 20th century, during post-war, there was a huge investment in agricultural research that the federal government made in kind of a post-war context. And agricultural research at land-grant universities played a large role in reimagining the practice of agriculture. What that meant is it freed the farm labor, and people like my father who got a college education, he said, do I become a teacher or do I work really hard and stay cold? And he was the first one to leave the farm. And a lot of people in that generation did. They got this access to education and the opportunities to become middle class in that post-war era and the kind of New Deal era gave people a lot of flexibility and opportunities, and many people left rural communities to seek an education and develop a livelihood and subsist at a middle class level. So my dad was part of that generation that really had that public investment at the federal level and at the state level in educating people in that generation to advance economically. So as we saw that rapid transformation in rural culture and the role that land-grant universities played in educating that population and changing the options, the lifestyle and economic options that they had, as I said, we saw this parallel experience in the way that agriculture was practiced. Now, when we look at the style of education, because of this emphasis on vocational education, what you saw particularly in the agriculture and what we might call the A&M or the A&T functions of land-grant universities, agricultural and technical or agricultural and mechanical, what we saw is a particular paradigm about how learning worked. And that came out of the Viennese tradition of how vocational education was formulated. And the idea there, it was based on this mechanistic paradigm that the ideal way to train somebody vocationally was through this sort of productivist, that efficiency was prized, that productivity was prized, that things were configured to streamline. And agricultural education was no exception to that. So as agriculture was reformulated under the idea that if you increase productivity, you increase farmer profits, and the way to increase productivity is to mechanize, do research on plant germplasm that increases yields. Of course, chemical inputs became part of the scenario in agricultural production, mechanized irrigation systems and the like. What you saw is this rapid increase in productivity, which was reflected the underlying value of this kind of productivist paradigm. And you saw the same set of values happening in the style in which this vocational education was designed at land-grant universities. So it wasn't just that farming changed. The idea of how you educated people to be farmers or in careers related, vocations related to agriculture, also changed in terms of the formulation. The other piece you saw in the early 20th century was to really figure out what our methodologies are to study agriculture and food production. So there were 2 sort of contesting narratives about the purpose of extension and the way that you conducted extension research. One of which was developed by a guy named Seaman Knapp. He was famous for developing the sort of plot-level research that a lot of agricultural scientists use now to study crop productivity and other cropping systems questions. And the other one was a little bit of a more holistic model by Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was on the faculty at Cornell a number of decades ago, who really saw the function of extension not to provide technology transfer by doing plot-based research find the findings, extend them to the farmer, ask the farmer to comply with the findings, but to say that the function of something like extension was to really build democracy in rural communities, and how is it that we design outreach and extension programs that play primarily a democratic function rather than an economic function. Knapp's paradigm won out, and this idea of extension playing this role in technology transfer and to build the economic base of farmers is something that we see that persists today, both in terms of the style and the design of how agricultural science research is conducted, but also in terms of the priorities and commitments of a lot of scientists who go into the agricultural sciences who feel a strong commitment to building the economy of rural communities and see their role not just as maybe being a plant breeder related to corn and soybeans, but also as developing the economic base of rural communities. So when you talk to a lot of faculty, for example, in the agronomy and plant genetics department here at the University of Minnesota, while their focus might be in the lab or in the field on a particular plant or a particular plant-related problem or question, what they will tell you is the research that they're doing is not just about feeding people, it's about building the economic base of farming communities and maintaining that commitment and seeing their role in terms of contributing to a healthy democracy is to contribute to the livelihood and the economic profitability of rural communities. And that's something you hear from a lot of folks as researchers, but also as educators, where they feel their role is to produce graduates who can go and make a decent living in an agriculturally related field. A couple of other brief comments that I would say is the University of Minnesota is unique and not unique among land-grant institutions. I mean, there's a vernacular and a set of commitments that I think you see across land-grant country around the type of agricultural system we have, the role that agriculture should play, not only in driving the economic engine of communities, but what kind of responsibilities do we have to addressing questions like world hunger, and what's the role of a large public research university, what kind of social and public commitment do we want to make to that question, whose responsibility is it to care about globally scaled issues around hunger and food production. And you see that as a particular commitment here at the University of Minnesota. Norman Borlaug, who was a graduate of the U of M's General College, a Nobel laureate. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. He's considered the father of what we call the Green Revolution, for those of you who've heard of that, with the idea that developing certain plant varieties that are resistant to disease, that are kind of a monoculture paradigm where you grow a lot of the same thing, and you use chemical inputs, and it's mechanized as opposed to a lot of hand labor. And because Borlaug plays such a prominent role here at the University of Minnesota, he died not too long ago, and if you go into Borlaug Hall over in the St. Paul campus, you'll find a bust of his head right by the front door, and you see flowers on the floor and on the sort of pedestal of this bust with an article that somebody's clipped out and put on poster board and leaned there. There's a fair amount of reverence for his legacy here and a lot of respect by many agricultural scientists about the social commitment to feeding the world and about the appreciation for the technological and social advances that they feel his contributions made. There's also a pretty healthy critique of that, which I'm sure some of you here are aware of, which is what happens when you dramatically transform the paradigms around the way that agriculture is practiced for the people who are doing the seed saving, for the people who are doing the agricultural labor, for the types of plant systems that are grown, for the local agricultural knowledge that might have been supplanted by essentially a Western export of a particular style of food production. And what does that mean for culture, and what does that mean for colonization? And what does it mean when you create a monocultural paradigm of what kinds of food is produced and what that means for local economies, what it means for creating, for addressing the issue of food self-sufficiency versus export economies of agricultural products and the like. And that commitment to that kind of mechanization and then technologization that we've seen through that kind of legacy, what I think we found as this vision of a very industrialized, very conventional, very mechanized, genetically souped up agriculture has run full force into Michael Pollan's tribe, right? And what you hear when you go to communities, and there's a lot of folks who care about food right now who are thinking a lot about these food issues, when you ask them what their vision for a new food system is, it's not lots of stuff grown in big fields where you don't know the farmer, and it uses a lot of chemical inputs, and it's highly technologized, and it's run through factories and distributed to large stores. That's not the vision that you hear at the community scale. What you hear is people are asking for intimacy in their food system, where they know where their food is grown, they know how it was grown, they know the person who grew it, they were involved in preparing it. And so you see these two competing worldviews about how we want to feed ourselves and how we want food to be produced. And there are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. I mean, I watch my next door neighbors who are urban homesteader wannabes, and they're raising their children free range, and I see the dead rats in their yard, and then they want a chicken coop, and it's like, if you have 200 mice in your garage next door to me, imagine when you start leaving corn out all over the place on the ground, what's going, so there's this commitment and interest that a lot of us have as locavores to this vision of a very intimate food system where we're beekeeping and growing our tomatoes in buckets, and everybody's canning, and it's all super great. But there's a lot of complicated questions in the local foods movement or the locavore movement that we haven't really asked. And it will be interesting to see the role that land-grant universities can play in helping us think through those tough questions. What role do disciplines like the social sciences and humanities in a land-grant institution have to play? So they too are embodying the land-grant mission as disciplines, contributing to the way we produce food and how we feed people. And at the same time, the agricultural sciences, which are funded primarily by federal and private sources, there's not much state and support left, and not a whole lot of federal support either. What role and what work do the agricultural and food sciences need to do to ask themselves some tough questions about some of the paradigms that they're getting critiqued about from people who might align themselves with this good food or this new food movement? So I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have over the next couple of days and the opportunity for the land-grant to reimagine itself. It's tried several times to do that, and I think it's on the cusp as we ask what kind of food system we want as Americans. This isn't the first time we've redesigned our food system. It's about the fourth. And so it's just time to do it again. And then the question is what contributions can the land-grant make, and what difficult self-interrogation does the land-grant have to undertake in order to be a good citizen, train the next generation of workers, and help build a food democracy.